G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Whenever I think about podcast topics, my first thought is to what would you, the audience, want to learn about? Now, some topics I'm pretty much up to speed and they're pretty easy for me really because I just draw on my own experience. But then there's some really cool topics that come up which I have a really small amount of knowledge about. Now, today's one of those podcasts and we're going to be discussing renewables, which is wind and solar. So why wind and solar? Well, I'm having more and more conversations with rural producers who are being approached by wind and solar companies looking for the option or contract over the rights to put a renewable project on their land. Now, I have given this a fair bit of thought, and I think there are three things that are fairly certain in this type of scenario. Number one, with any new and unregulated industry like the renewables, there's going to be traps that are not obvious early on, which we want to avoid if we can. Number two, there'll be sharks in the water looking for easy victims. Whenever there's money to be made off these things, there'll be people trying to find victims, and what I don't want to see is rural producers being the victims. And number three, lots of people are going to get burnt. You know, it goes without saying, and we'll probably go into that today, I reckon. Now, in saying that, I think the renewable space for rural producers could be a massive opportunity, and especially if they do their due diligence and get the right advice. So I want to know more, and I did what I always do when I want to know about contracts and legal issues, and I called my mate Tim Rivett, who's here with me again today. Tim's a lawyer and has been a guest on the podcast a number of times. He's got a solid knowledge in the renewable space and the issues you need to be aware of. Now, before we start, we've got to keep the lawyers happy. So the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for education purposes only. It's not financial advice, it's not legal advice, and you should not act on the information without appropriate specific advice for your particular circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor but choose to no longer be licensed and cannot and will not give you specific or personal advice in this podcast. So strap yourselves in and let's go on this learning journey together. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Ben. Always a pleasure to be here.
So now, today, Tim, we're going to have a good old conversation about renewables. And I think it's pretty fair to say that the world is heading down, investing significant amounts of money into the renewable space. And when I mean renewables, we're talking about wind and solar mostly today, and the impacts it's going to have in the rural community. And you can love them or hate them. I think the reality is they're here to stay. So the question I've got for you is, all the investments that's coming into the industry and the fact that more and more people are approaching farmers to get contracts and all those sorts of things in place to put wind farms and solar farms on their property, do you think they're just a flash in the pan or do you think they're here to stay, Tim?
Look, I think they're here to stay, Ben. You know, if you really think about Australia's commitment to net zero, it's a 5 to 10 year program. Yes, we're going to want to hit net zero by 2050. But the lofty goal of 43% reduction from 2005 levels is by 2030. So let's not delve into the murky waters of politics, but we have an Australian government which has made those commitments. They've legislated it. We're on the train. We probably can't get off the train even if you don't want to be on it. So I just can't see that in 5 years' time, once we get down this track, that we're going to have a total change in community values and we're going to go back to what we used to do, which is burning fossil fuels. So my thought and the way that I'm approaching this is to say we just have to deal with what's in front of us for the next 5 to 10 years, which is a huge influx of wind and solar projects. Yes, maybe some hydro stuff. We can talk about that another day because it's a very different kettle of fish. But here are some things that are going on in the background of the net zero. I read last week or a couple of weeks ago that the renewables over the summer quarter, so summer quarter to 31 December, really, accounted for more of the electricity output than burning black coal. Okay, so that's the first time that's ever happened before. We've always had a minnow renewables industry on industrial scale in Australia, but we burn coal. Okay, that's how we've always generated the bulk of our electricity. Now, a really cool headline, really great headline, probably got lots of eyeballs, lots of clicks. What does it actually mean? It just means that we're already on that path, right? So it's going to continue. Things are changing fast, and I don't see them slowing down for the next 5 to 10 years.
It seems to be that it's not only the government's pushing this, and they're borrowing enormous amounts of money. I mean, I don't even know what the dollars are now, but they're borrowing that money because we're running deficits to pay for this. But also, too, banks have got green targets where they've specifically come out and said, hey, you know, we're targeting so much of our lending to go towards these green targets or these green renewable type projects. And I think international super funds and investment companies are looking to deploy capital into this market. So it's almost, you know, like a perfect storm for the industry of money coming through. And I'm not really sure that it's necessarily the right deployment of the capital. But at the moment, that money's flowing in. And yeah, I agree. I don't think it's going to stop for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and love it or hate it, it's probably going to happen anyway. So you might as well at least understand it. You can grumble about it if you don't like it, but at least understand what's going to happen so you know that there are some opportunities there. You know, one thing I always say, Ben, is you and I are about the same age. When we were kids, people would talk about 2030 as if it was some science fiction futuristic place where we'd all ride hoverboards to school and work and there'd be space travelers. 2030 is only 7 years away now, and Australia's intention is to reduce or get to a target of 43% within 7 years. So what do we need to do to achieve that? We need to get our renewables share of the grid to 82% by 2030. We're currently sitting in the 30s somewhere in percentage terms. So yes, Australia's invested very heavily in a hydro project. We can talk about Snowy 2.0 if you like. Unfortunately, that's been a bit of a debacle over the last 6 months with the folding and the liquidation pending of Australia's oldest construction company. That's a huge heartbreak. I'm talking about Clough. Looks like they've done a deal with a foreign company, WeBuild, who are going to come in and hopefully finish off that project, Ben, because there's billions of dollars have been spent on Snowy 2.0 and it's not produced anything helpful for any Australian in terms of electricity output. So let's assume that they can get that on board. But it takes a long time to invest in this sort of technology. You can't just decide to create a solar array or a wind project today and start construction tomorrow. They're years in the planning and they're years in approvals. But to achieve what we need to, it's going to be a wild ride for the next 5 to 10 years.
Because that's a big gap to go from 30 to 35% up to 82% in only 7 years. I mean, that's mind-boggling. I'd love to see the mathematics of how many dollars have to be pumped into the system to get that to happen, because this is not a cheap thing to do, is it? It's not like they can turn around and build one power plant or two power plants, a nuclear one, and say, righto, well, we're done now. It's the infrastructure involved with finding the land, finding the right locations, and then building the infrastructure to, I suppose you'd say, to tie them all in together. It's just unbelievable, isn't it? And so are there laws changing around development and things like that right now, or are things fairly stable, Tim?
Yeah, so right now the laws are not changing, and that's a surprise to us in the legal industry, Ben, and particularly anyone in the renewables space. So something that's really important to understand is that renewable projects are not legislated. Okay, so if you've got coal in your backyard, you don't own anything that's under the ground. The government reserves the mineral resources, whether it's coal, oil, gas, whatever. But there are pieces of legislation that say if somebody wants to fossick, they can get a tenement and come and do some stuff on your land, i.e. dig some holes. If somebody wants to commercialise a resource that's under the ground, you are forced to negotiate with them and you can't just lock the gate. Okay. We are expecting, although nobody has talked about it yet, we are expecting a change in law which says if somebody wants to create or build or construct a renewables project in your backyard or on your land, you may be compelled and it may be compulsory to engage with them. Okay. That is not the case at the moment. So if you want to lock the gate and say, not in my backyard, we call them NIMBYs, Ben. There's a cool little acronym that probably started in Byron Bay or somewhere down there. If you want to be a NIMBY, that's cool today. But two things I would say to people who are negative on having these sorts of projects in their backyard. One is you will likely see legislative change in the next, I would say, 2 to 3 years, because if we start falling behind in this huge transition to go from 30-something% to 82% in 7 years, which is hugely ambitious, then the government will legislate that. Say, sorry, you can't just lock the gate. You've got to at least engage, and you've got to at least see whether it's a viable project. The other word of warning I say to people, and this is what I say to my clients when they come to me and say, should I engage with this company about this project? If they're talking to you, they're very likely talking to your neighbours and other people in the district. They've identified your district as something that's geographically located close enough to some backbone infrastructure that makes this project theoretically viable. Okay, they don't know yet because they haven't put sensors on your property and they haven't worked out the wind velocity and veracity and all those good things that they will have to do, the smart science people will have to do. But you're at least playing on the board game, right? So if you think you're just going to lock your gate and say, thanks, but no thanks, I'm really happy with what I'm doing, and I don't want to stare at wind turbines for the next 30 years, and I don't want my kids to stare at wind turbines for the next 30 years, you may not control that process, because if they go and put that on your neighbour's property, these things are 80 to 100 metres tall and you're going to see them anyway. So you might as well seriously consider about making some money out of the arrangement.
Yeah, that's a good point. And especially if the government's going to change the laws, and if they need to hit these targets, you can just imagine them bringing in legislation that will make it more compulsory. So do the numbers stack up for renewables, do you think, Tim?
Look, there's a lot of debate about it. I know a lot of it's political and there's differing views on the science, but let's unpack some numbers. So Australia, to achieve its target, needs about 7 megawatt wind turbines every month until 2030, plus 22,500 watt solar panels every day, 22,000 every day for the next 8 years. So we're talking about 60 million solar panels need to be in operation that are not even created today, plus 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines to plug them into the national grid.
That's ridiculous.
I don't want to confuse people with numbers, but just let that soak in, Ben, to achieve this goal, because we're not implementing and commissioning 22,000 today. Okay, we're behind the 8 ball. There's going to be a sort of parabolic curve. So we're going to start pretty slow. We're going to get all the approvals, get all the feasibility, get all the due diligence, and the demand for solar panels and all of the precious materials that go into making wind turbines and solar panels will be huge. We'll also be competing with other countries who are trying to do this. The numbers are truly staggering, and you're really going to see, if you want to do it, you've got to do it right. There's going to be a lot of focus, both political and also corporate capital, that are going to come into this space and say, we want to make this work. Here's a checkbook. How do we make it work?
Tim, this smells to me like the insulation bats, doesn't it? You know, remember the government came out and said we're going to put insulation bats in everyone's home as part of a government stimulus, and it turned into a debacle, didn't it? You can just see the numbers here. You know, what was it? 47 megawatt wind turbines every month. I mean, that's unbelievable. And then 22,000 solar panels every day. I mean, those numbers just defy belief. And just to be able to source those, I mean, the rare earth minerals, I'm guessing, that's in these, and the competition from other countries is going to be unbelievable.
Yeah, so lots of chatter, particularly in Australia, because we are resource rich around rare earths. So rare earths, the buzz. I'll put my hand up here, Ben. I failed high school science, but I've heard of lithium and a couple of these other hot materials and hot stocks. So rare earths, as they call them, are more an electric vehicle or battery concept. Okay, you don't necessarily need lithium to make solar panels or to make wind turbines. You do need them for batteries if you're going to store what you're going to generate and plug it into the grid tomorrow or later this afternoon. With wind and solar, though, you need huge resources. So we're talking about steel, iron ore. Great, we have that in the West. Fiberglass, silicon, selenium, all of these materials or minerals that Australia is rich in. The problem for us is we don't make stuff anymore, Ben. So we dig stuff up, we put it on a ship and we send it to other countries who make stuff. Then we've got to import it back as a finished product. So a solar panel or a wind turbine or a steel pole for the turbine to sit on, all those things. So huge transition. Yes, there's going to be huge opportunities. If you've got some of that stuff and access to some of that stuff, you're in the right space, which is wonderful. But you've got to think how long these projects take to plan and then commission, and how long the infrastructure takes to even build componentry, and then how long it's going to take to put it all together and plug it all in. It's hugely ambitious, hugely ambitious.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. So, Tim, with wind, solar, carbon credits, biodiversity, natural capital, all these environmental things, I get the sense that it's a bit of a gold rush in many ways. And I'm really conscious of the old saying, around these gold rush mentalities is that only people that make the money in a gold rush are the ones selling the shovels. And I think in this case, the landowners, the farmers and graziers, I'd think need to be starting to think about, well, which do we want to be doing? Do we want to be digging the holes looking for the gold, or do we want to be selling the shovels? Now, landowners can be a bit cavalier about the opportunity. I think that's, not really take it too serious. But should they be having an appropriate level of caution when dealing in this space, mate?
Yeah, definitely. And here's a couple of reasons. This is gold rush fever, right? We're seeing what we call prospectors, who are green branded companies going out to landowners and saying, can we sign you up to an access agreement? Okay, step one, we'll get to the sort of what is this documentation and what does it all mean in a minute in a bit more detail for everyone, because better to be forewarned and forearmed. An access agreement is just a seemingly simple and innocuous document that says, look, we'll come onto your land and we won't bother you too much. We might do some soil tests and we might put some sensors on your property and test the wind, that sort of thing. But while we're doing that, we'd really appreciate if you wouldn't talk to anyone else about other projects that we're trying to do. So we want exclusivity of negotiation. Okay, sounds really friendly. They won't offer you a lot of money to do that process. They might pay you legal fees, and that's the best.
But they will offer you some.
Yeah, a couple of bucks for the inconvenience and to get you interested, I suppose. But historically, and I'm talking only for the last probably 3 to 5 years, we've seen these access agreements used as a form of locking up large acres of land to prevent your competitors, the green company competitors that is, from coming in and talking to Tim and Ben, the landowners, or whoever. In my reckoning, statistically, you're talking about 7 out of 10 of these access agreements go absolutely nowhere. Okay, so they lock up your land for 12 to 24 months. The project never gets off the ground. They write you a letter to say, thanks for letting us onto your property for 12 to 24 months. We've gone in another direction. Good luck for the future. We're seeing that really dialed up at the moment because all of these companies who are capable of building solar arrays and wind arrays realize that without access to the land, they've got no project, right? So they're out there pushing landowners really hard to give them exclusivity. And you're going to start seeing a lot of these projects that weren't viable 2 to 3 years ago suddenly becoming viable and hopefully getting off the ground so that Australia can achieve what it wants to achieve. So the devil's always in the detail, right? You can sign an access agreement thinking that it's pretty friendly and it was just over a cuppa and they're only going to give you $5,000. But you've got to be so careful because the access agreement is the genesis or the nucleus of the whole negotiation in relation to a project that could be on your property for 30 to 50 years. I'll say that again, 30 to 50 years. So you're making decisions on these projects, not only for you, but for the next generation or the future owners of your property, whether that's people you know, your own children, your own family, or someone that you might need to sell your property to one day to fund your own retirement. So a word of warning is, yes, these are cool projects. They sound great. Do you want them in your backyard? Yes or no? That's the first question that you need to ask yourself. Is there some money to be made? Yes, there is. But really, please be careful with those access agreements, because if they are legally binding and you don't realise that, it's extremely difficult to deviate from them in the future. So the latest versions we're seeing, Ben, actually include commercial terms. So they include the basics of what you're going to get paid for the solar project or the wind project. When you don't even know if the project's viable or not, you've already locked into what you're getting paid. That's a difficult thing when you're not necessarily as educated as you want to be or need to be in this space to understand what you've just locked in for the next 30 plus years.
Because one of the things I noticed, Tim, when you and I had a chat about this is that it's unregulated. So there's no sort of standard, and correct me if I'm wrong here, there's no standard contract that these companies come out with. Like if you sell a property and you use a real estate contract, generally there's some standard clauses and regulation around this, whereas this is just an individual contract that you have with a company. So you can't rely on the fact that the contract's going to be standard, that someone's regulating it to make sure they're not taking advantage of you. And also there's not some sneaky legal clause in there that the lawyers have drafted up to be able to capture you. And I mean, like you said, you think it's this short-term little, we'll just come and do some testing on your property, but then you find out at the end of that period that you're actually locked in for 30 years. I mean, that's a pretty big error that someone could very, very simply make.
Definitely. And that's not your fault. That's just because these guys and girls are very good at what they do. They are salespeople, because these green companies have gone out and employed very clever and very charming salespeople to convince you to get interested and get excited about these projects, and you don't realise what you're signing. I'm not saying people are sitting ducks, but this is just so new. If you don't know the difference between a 5 megawatt and a 7 megawatt wind turbine, then you don't have the skills you need to negotiate these sorts of arrangements. You need to bone up and listen to podcasts and ask Ben, or whatever you need to do to get your head around it, because this will happen pretty quickly once they knock on the door.
Yep. And there's also too, is there generally like a confidential or a non-disclosure NDA within these contracts, so that you can't sort of go to your neighbours or go to someone else that's had it done and say, hey Tim, you went through this last year, or you're going through it at the moment. How's your contract going? What price have you negotiated? What are the terms? Most of them have got, I would assume, has got an NDA in it.
Yeah, always embedded in the access agreement is exclusivity. So you can't talk to any other company about the prospects of a project, and you can't talk to anyone else other than your own advisors, i.e. accountants, lawyers, financial planners, about the nature of the project. So that actually makes life a little bit difficult, because when you sit there and think, am I getting a good deal or am I getting a dud deal? There's no standardization of remuneration, of compensation, of money. It's all subject to negotiation, and it's all the Wild West. And because we don't have a long history in this country of these projects, there's no industry standard even, Ben. We've only created a lot of these projects in proof of concept scale. So yes, we have some solar array farms in Australia. Yes, we have a couple of, or a few, I should say, wind projects, but they were really put in place to prove that we could bring the technology to this country and that the people who are building them have the skills to put them in place. On scale that we need, they don't really exist yet, or they're under construction, or they've only been commissioned in the last 2 to 3 years. So there's no word on the street yet about what everybody is getting paid to enter into these arrangements. Remembering that you can't change your mind once you sign stuff. So even if an access agreement is considered what we call in the law non-binding, if it's got commercial terms in it, it's quite difficult to deviate from what you've already signed. Because if, for example, you say we're going to pay you a certain dollar figure per megawatt, and then you realise that the dollar figure you've just signed up to is half or a third of what another project in another district is receiving, it's very difficult to renegotiate that up, because you've still got to save face. Of course, you've always got the opportunity, if it's non-binding, to lock the gate again and say, no, this is my price. If you want this project to go ahead, I'm coming along for the ride. But enter into it with open eyes, because an access agreement is a really serious document. It's not just a little handshake, come onto my property and see if you like it. It's the start of the process, and it's really important.
So let's just be really clear about this. So you're sitting on your property and you get a knock on the door, so to speak. Someone comes around and says, hey, I work for XYZ green energy company, and we'd like to talk to you about putting a wind turbines, which seems to be the most common I'm seeing, or queries, a wind turbine on your property. And they come around and they say, we'd like to talk to you about that. And of course, the farmer says, well, yep, we're interested in talking to you. Firstly, you can't talk to any of your neighbours or any friends, to be able to understand how it works and to work out whether you're getting ripped off or getting a good deal. Secondly, you've got to sign a contract, which they'll pay you a pittance for, considering the fact what I've, $5,000 to $10,000 is once you've paid for the right tax advice, because you need advice from your accountant about, what are the tax implications of this? There's significant problems there. You've got to get legal advice to make sure the contract's right, because you can't rely on it being a standard contract. And so they're sitting there convincing you that this is not a big deal. Just sign this little contract. It just gives us access and allows us to just do some testing. And, you're not bound to this contract, etc. And, farmers go, okay, look, let's just move on. Let's just sign this. Talk us through the contracts. Like you're doing these contracts. You're helping people with this. What should they do? What's the first thing someone should do, Tim? And talk us through what they should be, other than what we've already discussed. What should they really be aware of, mate?
Yeah, so look, you've just asked a lawyer whether you should go off and get legal advice. This sounds extremely self-serving, Ben, but if you come to me after you've signed an access agreement, or come to any lawyer in this space once you've signed an access agreement and say the project is viable, the scientists have gone in and the engineers have gone in and said, yes, we want to do it, and now they've given me what's called an agreement for lease and a lease that runs for 30 to 50 years. That all sounds great, but we're stuck with the access agreement, right? Because you signed that 12 to 24 months ago, and I then have to absorb the terms of the access agreement without any input, any negotiation, which makes my job a heck of a lot harder when I negotiate what's called the next phase, or the option to lease, or the agreement for lease. So let's talk about the process. Get a knock on the door, some commercial negotiations. Are you interested? Are you not? Sign an access agreement. My absolute stance is please go and get some advice from both your taxation advisor, so your accountant, and also a lawyer who operates in this space about the terms of your access agreement. Okay, getting advice early is critical for all those reasons we've just talked about. So fast forward 12 to 24 months, you're getting a bit of a thumbs up from the company who wants to either go get the approvals and do the project, or don't forget, Ben, a lot of these Wild West prospectors, their only job is to go lock up land, get approvals, and then they're going to flog this project to someone else with much deeper pockets, right? A lot of these very clever scientists and engineers don't have billions of dollars or access to investments of billions of dollars. So it's a bit like property developers going and designing a tower, but they've got no intention of building it. They're just going to get someone else involved once they're shovel ready, if you like. They will put a document in front of you which is called an agreement for lease or an option to lease. Now, it will say, we're going to come onto your land and we're going to construct some stuff and we're going to make a mess. And if somebody injures themselves, that's not going to be your problem. That's going to be our problem. But you can't complain about the mess we're going to make, and you can't complain about the impacts we're going to have on your day-to-day operation, whether you're farming or grazing or whatever you've got going on. But the good news is we're going to pay you a couple of bucks during construction for the inconvenience, and we're then going to commission the project, and everybody wants to commission the project because that's when the dollars start flowing, right? Commissioning means you switch the thing on, and AEMO, which is the grid operator in Australia, the electricity operator, starts paying you for wholesale electricity or allowing you to sell it to other people, either wholesale or retail. So we're talking still about years in the future, because these projects can take even still 6 to 24 months to actually build once you've got all approvals, all the money's done. So that document will say there's a construction phase, construction project, we'll pay you a couple of bucks. Once it's commissioned, the good times roll, and we will enter into a lease, and that lease usually gets stacked in 10-year terms for at least 30 years, possibly 50 years, which means that the owner of that infrastructure can go for 10 years and say to you, listen, thanks very much, but the project's not viable, we're shutting it down. Or they can exercise an option, go for another 10 years, roll into the future at their discretion. So a couple of really big things to think about. One is, what happens at the end of the project, Ben? Because this gear ain't cheap to get off your property. At the moment, there's a lot of technological advances in recycling of solar panels and also wind turbines, but at the moment they're non-recyclable. So if somebody goes broke during construction or even when you're in the lease phase, make sure under the lease you're protected with some rights to have somebody else remove the stuff from your property, okay? Because if you get stuck with that financial obligation, you won't be very happy, and you won't want defunct wind turbines sitting on your property for the next 100 years.
Because there's not going to be like one or two wind turbines, is there? Like, they're not going to do a project with one or two. There's going to be multiple turbines sitting on your property. And you can imagine 20 years from now, Tim, a company goes broke. Well, if they're broke, or if it's an international company, let's say a European company or say a Chinese company or something is doing this project, they go broke, or they just say, look, we don't care. We're not paying for this. You're stuck with, I would think, millions of dollars worth of cost to clean that up. And not only that, the impact on the value of your property could be substantial.
Definitely. And look, the good news is, if you do this right, you can lock in a revenue stream for the next 20 to 50 years. If you're in farming or grazing and it doesn't rain, you may not have a good year. I know people have irrigation licenses. That's a very broad brush statement. But if the wind blows and the sun shines, you're going to get paid. Okay. So that's why, in theory, these technologies can sit pretty happily side by side with rural operations. Now, what size of land are we talking here, Ben? We're talking about 60 acres of land per megawatt of output for a wind turbine. Okay, 60 acres sounds like a lot. We're not locking up that 60 acres. It's just that you can't put wind turbines too close to one another, because one will change the way that the wind blows, and you've got to space them out. They only use about 3% of that actual 60 acres. So you're talking about a pole which is 1 to 2 meters in thickness, in width, 80 to 100 meters in the sky. Some of them are only 50, but depends on how they want to capture the wind. The thing you've really got to think about is, if you let these guys on your property, what loss of productivity impact does that have on your day-to-day operation? Yes, you're going to get paid some money, but what's the downside? What's what we call the opportunity cost? What are you going to lose in order to let them onto your property? Loss of production. Solar is a really obvious one, because solar is land greedy, right? It's land rich. And as a rule, large animals and solar don't mix. Okay, I'm talking really about cattle. Most of the time, a solar array will have a large exclusion zone, and they will say, really don't want your cattle grazing through the rows of the solar panels because your beasts are too big and they can easily do some damage. Sheep are a little bit better. Okay, goats are a little bit better because they're smaller livestock. But as a rule, you're going to lose a lot of productivity in a solar array situation. Wind, to me, particularly in the Central Queensland region, which is where I live and most of my work is done, wind to me is a more intriguing coexistence, if you like, Ben. So the exclusion zones are either zero or very small. So theoretically, your livestock could graze underneath a wind turbine. Because they're so high in the air, the blades don't go anywhere near the ground. So most of these agreements say we're really comfortable with your animals grazing right underneath these turbines. So your loss of productivity is far less. Longevity, though, is a huge consideration. What is this project going to look like in 20 years when the sexiness of renewables is out of the market and they're starting to become expensive to maintain and they're starting to lose a bit of their output, if you like, particularly solar, because solar panels lose their output as they get older. But as a general rule, solar arrays and wind turbines should last for 20 to 30 years if they're well maintained and well taken care of. So I will always say to my clients, Ben, you sign this deal in the next 2 to 3 months. How does this fit in with your succession plan? And I'm talking here about the holistic succession. Are you going to sell this property one day to fund your retirement? Are you bringing your children into the operation? Are you bringing other more distant family members into the operation? This is that estate planning and succession 101 stuff that we've done previous podcasts before. You've always got to bear in mind, because of the length and longevity of these projects, you're making decisions for your future generations, if you like, whoever that may be. So just make sure that you've thought about that, because if you like renewables projects, but you end up handing over your property to an adult child or whatever, and they say, gee, I wish you hadn't done that, they're stuck with it, right? You can't just change your mind once you're in the middle of this 50-year agreement and say, get off my property. You lose your legal rights to do that.
And that's a really important point, because like we mentioned before about the company might be all great to deal with in the beginning. We want to, work with the landowner because we want this project to go ahead. Once it's up and running, I'm pretty sure that they're not going to be as accommodating and nice to deal with. And who knows, in 5 years or 10 years, the company that you've originally dealt with could have sold that project a dozen times. That project could be on your land and it's owned by, let's just say, a super fund based in the United States. They don't really care about the landowners. They just care about that the money's going to keep pumping in from the project. And so you just really don't know who you might end up being in bed with, so to speak, many years down the track. But in saying that, like you mentioned before, I think, there's a lot of risks here. I think there's a lot of risks that people need to consider, and getting good advice is important. But we also can't underplay the significant opportunity, to have an alternative income stream, which in some people's situations will be substantial. I mean, we only need to see what happened with the gas industry when people started having gas wheels on their place. It's made a huge difference to the business operation. Yes, there's some downsides and negatives, but there's also a lot of ups. And, doing things like reducing debt, the ability to expand, extra income means you can take on more debt to take on more country, succession planning. It could be around, the fact that it makes the business more viable going forward. It could be, providing income streams or assets for non-farming children. It could be funding retirement. There's a whole heap of opportunities. And also too, Tim, I've seen that, in these cases, there's an opportunity for the family to be able to provide, services to maintain some of this. Is that correct? And obviously not servicing a wind turbine, getting up on a crane and, I don't know, changing the oil or whatever they do, but the place needs to be maintained and roads and all that sort of stuff. There's an opportunity there as well. Is that right?
Yeah, great opportunities for the landowner. Here's a couple of examples for you. They're huge construction projects, right? We all know enough about construction projects to know that there's a huge influx of labour and materials when you're putting this stuff together. And then the maintenance phase is obviously a lower labour and materials impact. But let's assume someone's going to bring, and we talked about scale, right? So based on those numbers that I just gave you, scaled up viable projects at the moment we're seeing are a minimum of 50 turbines for wind. Some of them we're seeing feasibility up to 200 to 300. So at 60 acres per wind turbine, you're talking about very large projects, and you're, depending on your holding, you're probably talking about multiple landowners being involved in the one project. Okay, if you're lucky enough to have those acres, then great, you can have the project wholly contained on your property. But we're in a phase now where the concept is proven, so you're not going to see 10 of these things on a property as a viable project. It's just not big enough to create the scale and to justify the expense of the backbone transmission line. You've got to go big, right? Go big or go home, as they say.
And this is probably a really good point to make that I want listeners to think about when they're thinking about these projects is you might know someone who's a neighbour, or you could be the neighbour that puts their head in the sand and just says, I want nothing to do with this. Did you say 200 to 300 wind turbines?
Yep.
Yeah, so if you can imagine your neighbour turns around and says, yep, you don't want anything to do with this, but I'm going to put 200 to 300 wind turbines on my property, and it happens to be right next door to your place and right next door to the homestead, and you get to look at that and possibly have all the downsides for the next 30 years. You don't want to be putting your head in the sand. You want to be looking at this and going, well, I can't stop this, or I might as well get paid for the inconvenience and actually engage in this process and get some help.
Definitely. And, what I was saying before about the NIMBYs, which is this buzz acronym, not in my backyard, that's what it stands for. If you're the difference between a viable project and not, because the operator needs 5 properties and you're number 5 and all your neighbours are on board, yes, everyone's signed a confidentiality agreement, so you may not be able to talk to your neighbours, but people do things. But they will either work out, if you're a holdout, they will either work out a way to get around your property and not use it and still make it viable. So again, you've got all the downsides. You've got to look at these things. You're going to have huge inconveniences based on the construction phase and all the things that go on.
And the maintenance.
People coming and going and bringing weeds and, all the things, but you're not going to get the remuneration, are you? You've missed out. All your neighbours have got passive income streams or diversified income streams, and you're the holdout, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but suddenly your property is less valuable than your neighbours because you don't have that diversified income. So that's a tough position to be in, Ben, for people, and I don't envy people who find themselves in that position, but that's where good advice and understanding what this industry is all about and what this project is all about can mean the difference between making a good decision and one you might regret.
And I think it goes down to the old saying, Tim, isn't it? It's you can't sometimes help what cards you're dealt, but you can definitely work on how you play the game and how you play those cards. And I think that's the point I'd probably make is you can be a NIMBY and hold out, which is fine. That's everyone's God-given right is to be able to say no, and totally respect that. But you just got to think a bit strategically, because I've got this sense, Tim, listening to the volume and the way the government acts these days is I'm pretty sure they'll put legislation in place at some stage to be able to make these projects happen easier, because if they've got to put in that amount of infrastructure, they can't have landowners saying no. That's just a fact. And I'm not saying in any way, I just want to be really clear, I'm not saying that's a good idea in any way, shape or form, but you can just sense that that's where we're going to get to be able to make these things happen quicker. And, they've got to get consent. I mean, you've got to get consent from your bank to do this as a mortgagee. They've got to consent to this going on the property. You've got to get tax advice. How is this going to impact you? They're going to have to grease the wheels to make these things happen quicker, aren't they?
Yeah, in my mind, the legislation to mandate or force landowners to at least engage with renewable contractors or renewable companies and operators. It's not an if. In my mind, it's going to happen. It's just when. It's probably not going to happen in 2023 because there are other more pressing things to think about. But fast forward 2 years from now, if we're way behind in the commitment to 2030, whatever government is in power, let's not go into politics. Governments change and things change and priorities change. But if you think of the history of the mineral resources industry and the oil and gas industries, they were unregulated in this country for a very long time, and anyone who wanted to develop or take advantage of those resources just had to do a deal with whoever owned the land or do a deal with the government. Legislation came to make that easier because Australia wanted to develop those resources and get rich, and we've done a really great job of that. So politically, and the community attitude, community values is commitment to renewables projects. If we don't self-regulate and it doesn't work for the next couple of years, you should expect there is going to be legislation which will force you to talk to these companies. Just like there is for the oil and gas industry, just like there is for the coal industry, just like there is for iron ore, mineral resources, all those things. The legislation wouldn't be very complicated to put together, Ben, because it's fairly similar to what's already in place for those other things, except that most of those other things are subterranean, as in they're under the ground. This is a little bit different because you own what's above the ground to a certain height. Wind turbines and solar panels are actually on your property, not on the government's reserved subterranean rights. So I think it's when, not if. And that's why I say to people, I'm totally fine if you're a NIMBY, but you may not be able to be a NIMBY forever. So at least educate yourself in this space, because if somebody's already knocked on the door, I suspect they'll knock again in 2 to 3 years and they'll have a different deal on the table.
And I think it's a really good time now to start doing your research on this, Tim, because there's no point doing your research once someone does knock on your door. You want to do the research now and understand how this works. So if it does pop up, and also another piece of advice I think makes perfect sense is not to invest too much time. So if someone does knock on your door, don't start counting your pennies and working out what you're going to do with the money until you've gone through the process. Because I think there will be a lot of false starts. And like you said, I think a really good point earlier was these companies are just coming out trying to lock up land. And if you can imagine, just for anyone who's listening, someone just sets up a company, calls it Ben and Tim's green energy company, and we go around and we sign up farmers to be able to say, here's a project, we'll put it on, and then we go to, say, international companies and say, hey, we've got all these land options, would you like to buy those off us? And that's going to happen more and more and more with the smart players out in the marketplace to be able to try and sell it, because there is that demand. So, Tim, we're getting to the end of the podcast, mate. We're running out of time. I could talk about this for bloody days, but is there a couple of things you want to add before we sign off today?
Probably just a couple of things, Ben. Remember the opportunity. Okay, investigate it. Don't just say no to start with. I sound like I'm trying to sell this to you. I'm not. I just don't want people to make a knee-jerk decision and say, not in my backyard, without actually thinking this through. So the opportunity is diversified income. The opportunity is to sell these projects some materials that are already on your property. So they're going to need road-based gravel. They're going to need access to water. They're going to need workers' camps. They're going to need all those things. It makes total sense to get as much of that as they can from you, because their mobilization costs are so much lower. Okay, so there's a short-term and a long-term potential upside for you. We have seen these work really, really well. Okay, if you look back through the history of, say, the last 3 to 7 years, there are proven concepts where landowners and renewable energy companies can coexist quite well. I know there's a lot of bad stories out there about mineral resources companies, oil and gas companies, that sort of thing. That is a very different industry because of all those reasons I just told you about. This is your land, it's above ground. But just be open-minded to the opportunity, because you might end up with 20 to 50 years of passive income stream that actually increases the value of your property, but doesn't significantly decrease the productivity of your existing operation. And I'm talking particularly about wind. Solar is different, yes, because they want to lock up more acres than, say, a wind project. But my 2 cents, I suppose, is just at least be open-minded and do your homework, educate yourself on what this is. And if you say no, that's cool, but don't say no without understanding what this opportunity is, because it's massive. Australia's commitment to the 2030 targets are huge. And if you want to be part of it, there's going to be an opportunity for you to be part of it.
And your no might be no right now, but have an open mind that it may not be no in the future as things evolve. Because like with green companies, they can come out and look at your property and say, look, this isn't a viable project, but 5 years from now, if the market changes, it could be. And it could be the same for you. You're at a position in your life where you go, look, we don't want this on our property, but it could be your kids come along in 5 to 10 years and go, hey, mum and dad, we want to retire you off the farm and give you that retirement you need. And we want to take on a viable business and expand and grow and all these sorts of things. And we think a renewable project would be great. So always even if you go through the project and you go, it's not a yes for me, it's a definite no, be open-minded that in 5 to 10 years that might change. Don't lock it completely down.
Definitely. It might be 2 years, Ben. Nothing like switching off a coal-fired power station to refresh the viability of some of these projects, which 2 years ago wouldn't work. But when you're faced with the sort of things that are going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, suddenly everything's back on the table.
Appreciate that. And one little bit of advice from me is when you do go get advice, so you speak to your lawyer, you speak to your accountant, is just make sure they understand not only the contract that you're signing, it's understanding the whole industry and having a previous experience. Because I think it's not just the words in the contract, it's the context to your situation that's probably the most important, and understanding how that all works. So just make sure you're really careful on who you listen to. So we're out of time today, Tim. As always, mate, it's always great to have these conversations. I knew very little about renewables when I started on this project with you a couple of weeks ago, and now I feel like after this I know a whole lot more. I'm still very much a newbie to it. So if anyone wants to find you online, Tim, where can they find you, mate?
Probably website's best, Ben, rhrlaw.com.au, Tim Rivett, Rivett. Thankfully, it's a weird name, so if you Google me, I'll probably come up. But yeah, always happy to talk to anyone who wants to know more or has had that rat-a-tat-tat on the door and they're not sure what to do next.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks very much for your time today, Tim. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one.
Always heaps of fun, Ben. Thanks so much.
Well, that was another information-dense podcast, and I've been writing a whole heap of notes, so I hope you've been doing the same. I think it's a really important point just to reinforce. It might seem obvious, but I want to do it anyhow, is to get good advice from the right people before you sign a contract. And also too, before you spend too much time, researching, because you can spend a lot of time, effort, energy researching something that may not actually be worth researching. Also too, try and find other people that have been in a similar situation, remembering that with some of these contracts, there's non-disclosure agreements. So you just need to be really careful when having those conversations, check things out. Now, if you know anyone that might happen to be, thinking about renewables or interested in that space, make sure you share the podcast. It's put a smile on my face to hear the number of people that have been sharing the podcast with family and friends and saying they're getting great feedback, which, makes this job so much more enjoyable, knowing that it's actually valuable to everyone. If you've got any feedback, if you've got any information or any podcast topics you'd like to know more about, drop me an email at ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. Now that's it for this week, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.